to the Voices from the Periphery. I am Udisha Doloy, and hereby we all sit together to enlighten ourselves with today's theme from field to plate, understanding ancient human environment interaction through the study of foodways. Professor by none other than Professor Kalyan Chakraborty. Professor Kalyan Shekhar Chakraborty specializes in biomolecular archaeology and archaeological geochemistry. His research interest is in reconstructing ancient animal herding practices. His research explores the role of domesticated animals and the interrelationship between humans, animals, environment in the development and dispersal of complex societies in South Asia, especially in India. His current research interest is in reconstruction of traditional indigenous diets and the effects of European expansion on traditional food practices in southern Ontario, Canada. Currently, he is a faculty at Ashoka University, and apart from that, he is pursuing his postdoctoral research at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History as an Alexander von Humboldt postdoctoral fellow. In addition, he is collaborating on a Social Science and Humanities Research Council Canada funded project that aims to reconstruct the traditional indigenous diet of the Six Nation population of southern Ontario using ceramic residues. Some of his important works are channel-handled vessels or ladles from Indus Age Gujarat, possible evidences for a capacity measuring system, a preliminary report on the lipid analysis of ceramics, excavation at Kotada Bhadli, Taluka, Nakhatrana district, Kutch, Gujarat, inventory of human skeletal remains from India. So I hope everyone is ready with all ears to enrich themselves with today's topic, and I request sir to carry forward today's lecture. On to you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for highlighting all the works that I've been doing. I'll try to share my window. So, can you see my PPT? And do you see it in full screen or?
Yes, sir, we can see.
No.
We can see. Full screen, sir.
Full screen, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
No, sir, it's
Perfect.
not full screen. It's just the slides, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. It's okay, sir.
Okay, let me try it again. Just 1 second. I think. Just share screen. Okay, now?
Yes, sir. Now it's full screen, sir.
Full screen, right?
Yes, sir. No.
Yes.
Okay,
Sir,
perfect.
we are going live too, sir. Just to inform you.
Sure.
Okay, sir.
Okay, so I think there are about 7 or 8 of us. So what I'll do is, okay, just to give you a brief about what I do in general. So I teach in a history department at Ashoka University. I'm trained in anthropology, but my work is primarily biomolecules, lipids, isotopes, those sort of things. So just a bit of caution, there would be some science in here. So I don't know the profile of most of the students. So feel free to stop me at any point, ask me questions if things are not clear to you. We don't have to cover the entire presentation, that's fine. I can tell you the story about it. But it is important that we understand every part of it, then it will be meaningful, otherwise it will be not. So I'll try to make it more of an interactive session rather than me just talking to my computer. So before I start, I have one question for you all, and any of you can answer it, just so that I understand that you have an understanding of what I'm going to talk about. So, if I ask you what is the difference between weather, climate, and environment, can anybody give me, like, tell me an understanding of yours about weather, climate, and environment? Any of you? What do we understand when we talk about, when we say it's the weather? So what is the weather?
Sir, the weather the weather can be changing from day to day basis. Today, the today's weather can be different from tomorrow's or yesterday's weather. The climate is overall a uniform climate in one particular geography, and environment is it includes all of the flora and fauna and biodiversity in an area, a big area.
Yeah,
That's
yeah. So yeah, mostly right. So a climate is the atmospheric condition of one particular time. So it's a short time atmospheric condition. So if you go look outside your window, what you see is the weather, right? So whether it's sunny, it's cloudy, it's raining, it's hot, it's cold. So that's the weather. It's a short term, climate, short time atmospheric condition. Now, if you're talking about long-term atmospheric condition and we're talking about trends, then we're talking about climate, right? So a climate of India, of a geographical location, or the climate of Holocene, then there's no geographical location, but we're talking about a time period, or a climate of, winter climate, summer climate. So it's generally a long-term trend of what we are seeing. So average of the most of the climates, most of the weather that we are seeing, and then we are predicting. So we can do prediction of weather prediction. So based on the condition of the past few days, we can predict the weather, what it will be tomorrow. Climate also we can predict based on the trends that we are seeing in for a long term. Then we can predict the future climate. Now, when we talk about weather, when we talk about environment, yes, it definitely is the climate, the weather, but it also includes two very distinct things. One is the nature. So whatever is available in the nature, so it could be plants, animals, your landscape, rivers, mountains, dust, wind, air, everything, right? And then you also have your cultural environment, right? So say, for example, one region belong to one particular culture, there comes the economy, there comes the politics. All these sorts of things comes under environment, right? So when we are growing under one environment, it could be both physical and it could also be cultural. Now, the environment is what detects how human would react to certain things, or the behavior of a human would, to a certain extent, would be defined by the environment. To give you an example, if you want to start a fishery in Rajasthan, it would be very difficult, right? Because the environment of Rajasthan would not support it, right? So it's not only the climate, but it's the overall environment in general. So then you have to come up with all artificial things to promote your fishery business, right? So in ancient time, when we're going back in time when we didn't have so much of technology, our environment would determine a lot of things, like the clothes that we will wear, the food that we will eat, the kind of animals and plants that we will domesticate. So say, for example, you would see in some places horses were domesticated first before cows or buffaloes or goats or sheep. In some places, like if you go to North America and South America, you'll see weird animals getting domesticated, like rodents, all those type of things. And then if you go to some other places, then you will see the first domesticated animals were cattle and buffalo. So it's the environment of that region would determine what animals were available, what the climate was, and that would lead to certain sort of domestication. Same for plants, right? You will see in some places wheat and barley getting domesticated, some places millet, some places rice, some places corn, some places potato. So depending on your environment, a lot of these human behaviors are determined, right? So it's not only the domestication, but also like what sort of food you will eat, right? So say, for example, if you belong to a cold country, there could be food that you could preserve for a long period of time. So then you will have a different way of preparation of the food and different way of consuming the food. versus you have hot and humid countries like India. There will have a very different way of preparation and consumption of food. Now, today we can see the climate, right, and weather. So we can do a prediction of the future, how it would be using various mathematical models and stuff like that. But what about past? Because in past we cannot see the climate, right? So there is no way we would know what was the weather, let's say 4,500 years ago. There's no way we can tell it. Or what was the climate of 4,500 years ago? Or what was the landscape look like 4,500 years, 5,000, sometimes 10,000, 20,000, 100,000, 500,000 years ago? What was the landscape look like? We have no idea because nobody has recorded it. We don't have any sort of picture proof of that. So then we have to look into remains in the form of isotopes, in the form of biomarkers, in the form of biomolecules. Sometimes we can also do DNA in order to understand what the past climate, past environment was. And then we have to rely to multiple proxies, right? So the proxy could be isotopes, the proxy could be sediment, the proxy could be human remains, plant remains, fossils. If you go to museums, you'll see that in a museum, there was a picture, a reconstructed picture of landscape of Jurassic area, like Jurassic time period, right? So your question should come like, how did these people know that the climate was like that, or there were this kind of plants, there's this kind of animals? Based on the fossils, right? Because we have fossil evidences. So that's a proxy that would let us to reconstruct the environment of that particular time period. So similarly, food is one of the things that we can use to reconstruct the environment of a time period, but also it would help us to understand how human interacted with that particular environment, because so whatever remains or human material remains that we see today, not only material, obviously in the past we don't see religious remains, like ideological remains, but even today the religious identity, religious remains, material remains, they all are a product of human interacting with their environment. Right. Now, one thing before we go ahead, there is also a distinction between food and foodways. Can any of you tell me what is the difference between food and foodways? Anybody?
Sir, pardon, what's the question again, sir? My network
What is the difference?
bad, sir.
What is the difference between food and foodways?
Sir, food wave is what I can say. Food is what we can eat, but food wave is just like a food cycle or cycle like thing that.
Yeah, no, you are about right. So try a little bit more.
Food wave, I can say, is a natural interconnection of food chains and graphical representation like that.
Okay. Yeah. So a food is a product. Yeah. Go ahead, Riju.
Sir, I think the food waste is like the role, and it can be said that it is the role and the contribution of food in civilization or in the process of civilization.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, you both are partly correct. So I'll tell you what it is. A food is an object, right? A natural object that you can consume, right? So it could be any plant, any fruit, any meat, anything that you can consume would be considered as food. Now, food waste is the entire process of that. So starting from the food production, all the steps that you take for the food production, then it comes to food distribution, then it comes to food production, then it comes to food consumption, and then it also the discard of all the waste food remains. So this entire process is the food way. Okay, so the way through which human consume their food. And that food way would vary from time to time, from culture to culture. From region to region, this food way would vary extensively. So say, for example, in Bengal, we have a very distinctive food culture, right? There is a food way of us. But if you put it in a larger time frame, you would see that this tradition has changed over time. It is not the same as it is today, right? It used to be slightly different. So you will see the food production has changed. You will see there were a lot of mixing and a lot of new ideas that came into the food, and now today you see a lot of fusion foods. So all these kind of things have changed the way food is prepared, but it also changed the way food was consumed. So if you look into your grandparents, some of you will see that they have a very distinct way of eating foods versus we have a very distinct way of eating foods. And even the younger generation, they also have a very distinct way of eating foods. So like standing in front of a stall, eating fast food was not a part of Bengali diet, right? It is a very recent thing. So, that's a change in the food way, right? Also, like what sort of food we are eating, what's the source of it, what's the cooking style, the ingredients that we use, everything that makes it a food way. So when we're talking about studying human environment interaction through foodways, we are talking about all these processes, right? So the selection of food, the production of it, the distribution of it, the consumption of it, the discard of it, studying all of it can tell us about the particular environment and how human interacted with the environment. Now, even today, if you just go to, like, Durga Puja will come very soon, and if you just go around and look into multiple stalls and how people would eat, just by looking at, you would be able to tell a lot of things. Say, for example, geopolitics, what sort of geopolitical interactions we have. You can talk about local politics, you can talk about regional politics, you can talk about economy, you can also talk about how different strata of people are. Like, some people are going into like 5-star restaurants, having food for the puja. Some people are enjoying in the street food. You'd also see different generations preferring different places to eat. So you can see a lot of these things, and you'll also see a clear regional and climatic impact on the type of food that we're eating. So this is exactly something that we'll take in the past. Now, the problem with the past items is that we don't have this kind of visual representation, right? It's very difficult, like when you're talking about prehistoric period, we don't have written records, we don't have visual representation of how people were eating and what people were eating. Data is very fragmentary. So based on those fragmentary data, we have to reconstruct what people were eating, how they were eating it, how they were producing it, what they were producing it, what were their primary source of macronutrients, micronutrients, how they were discarding their foods. So because as archaeologists, we mostly work on the discarded material. So we need to know if the discard that we are seeing, whether it's a cultural discard, whether there are natural changes, whether there are any sort of physical changes that has happened. So in order to understand that, we need to know if the discard that we are working, is it the discard that we are expecting, or it is somehow altered through time, right? So this is the entire background of this study. Now, so for today, we'll mostly talk about in the civilization and the area that I've worked primarily during my PhD. However, I have expanded way beyond in the civilization and at different time periods. I'm not incorporating those data here, primarily because a lot of it is not published, but also because it will be too big. So this is a method or methodological approach that we can take, both methodological and theoretical approach that we can take and apply it in different places, and then we talk about life, right? Also, one thing is, when we're dealing with archaeology, it is not that, it's fine that we document what we have found. Like, sometimes you'll see in the newspapers that, we have found this site, what they have found gold, they have found this ornament, they have found this many skeletons. So you see this list of things that archaeologists have uncovered underneath the earth. But what is more important is to tell a story of those people who were living at that time using those particular material remains. And this is what I do primarily as my part of the work, and that also using remains that are invisible, right? So we're mostly biomolecules and isotopes and things like that you cannot see. So there are physical remains, and then within those physical remains, there are also remains that you cannot see, but you can actually analyze. Okay, so as I said, that my primarily focus is prehistoric remains from South Asia. Now, when I say prehistoric, some of you might have an idea that, prehistoric means we are talking about Stone Age. No. So for me, for the current understanding, let's talk prehistoric means where there is no written record, or even if there is written record, it has not been fairly deciphered, right? So when we're talking about cultural evolution that we have seen in South Asia, particularly in India, we know that earliest hominin occupation is about 1.5 million years ago, and then slowly we have seeing people transitioning into different phases of Stone Age into a farming community. So we call them as early farming communities of India. Now, some people would call it as Neolithic, but then that is not a right term, because in some places we see Neolithic as the early farming communities. In some places we see Chalcolithic as the early farming communities. So when we're talking about early farming communities, the people who have started farming in that area, the first communities who have started farming in this area. So depending on where you are in India, it has different time period. So we know Indus Valley is definitely one of the oldest, goes back to about 7000 BC when we see the first early farming communities emerging. Also, the Ganga Valley also has a similar time period going back to 6000, 7000 BC. However, the amount of work that has been done in Indus Valley has not been done in Ganga Valley, so we don't have a lot of data. But if we leave these two main regions, the other regions, then it starts a little late. So say, for example, in Northern Neolithic, so if you have heard of sites like Burzaham and all, so there goes about 3000 BC. In the southern regions, then also we see Chalcolithic cultures or Neolithic cultures about 3000 BC. Then in the Brahmaputra region, we also see the early farming communities coming up about 3000 BC. So for today, we'll only talk about Indus Valley civilization. Now, in these early farming communities, another major thing is that not only that they were heavily influenced by the climate, because they are not just people that are moving from region to region and like seasonally moving or moving long distance, but now they are settled, right? So they are settled in one particular geographic location, and they are constantly working with the environment of this region, right? So the rainfall of this region, the landscape, if there are mountains, if there are plains, if there are rivers, if there are perennial rivers, if there are seasonal river, what sort of vegetation is there? Is it a forest landscape or is it a grass landscape? So this entire environment of that region has started influencing these people, and you'll constantly see that people have constantly interacted with this particular environment to come up with a culture that we see in the form of their material remains. Okay, do you have any questions so far?
No, sir.
You can also ask me, like, if I'm going too fast, you can ask me to slow down. That's also fine. Okay, so one of the major things of these early farming communities that we see are the production of ceramics, right? So pre-settled lifestyle, what we have primarily stone tools. So different kinds of stone tools. So some of you might have seen, like the early hominins, they have produced hand axes. Then, there are blade tools, there are microlithics and all sorts of things. And then we come to the early farming communities when we, along with the settled life, we also have one thing that human produced, okay, that is ceramic. Now, the difference between ceramic and a stone tool is that ceramic is something that does not exist in nature. You have to produce it through multiple. So you have to take clays, to mix different clays. You have to prepare the clay, then you have to give it a shape, then you have to fire it and all sorts of things. So you're producing this part of the thing. Whereas stone tools, you have a shape in mind, you break the tool, you use it. Sometimes you use it on ad hoc basis, sometimes you give it a particular shape, right? Now, ceramic has a lot of information embedded in them, okay? But the problem with India is that if you remember that we have primarily used Indian ceramic to create punctuated chronology, right? So we have used ceramic as a typological indication of a culture, right? So Harappan ceramics, I don't know, like how much exposure you have with archaeology, but I'm assuming that these broader terms you have heard. So Harappan ceramics have, a particular identity. Then we have separated Harappan civilization into early, mature, late. Also, again, based on the ceramic or changes in the ceramic that we see. Then we see Iron Age. in that part of the world, part of the country. And there also we see new type of ceramics. Then we see historic time period, new type of ceramic. Then we see northern black polished ware and all sorts of things. And that also goes true for Bengal as well. We have Chalcolithic pottery, then we have early historic pottery, then we have medieval pottery. And then we can, by looking into this pottery, like somebody working in this region, if you take a potsherd, go to that person and ask him like, can you tell which culture this particular shirt belong to? 90% of the time, that person would be able to tell you, okay, this is a medieval shirt, this is early historic shirt, this is a Chalcolithic shirt, or whatnot. Now, that's fine. But then we are using this particular ceramic for creating chronology, but not to tell about the story of the human who have produced it. Right. Now, that's very important because pottery is not an inert expression of human intention that changes only due to diffusion, migration, contract, or due to adaptive responses to external stimuli, such as climate change. Now, the entire idea of this punctuated chronology is based on that a systematic approach to culture change, which thinks that if there is no diffusion, migration, contact, or external influences, people will not change, so they will make certain type of pottery. And now that there is a change, so that means something has happened, and then we talk about culture change. Otherwise, the culture will continue. So that's the main idea behind creating those sort of punctuated chronology using pottery. Now, but pottery is not only that, but pottery has a lot of information embedded in that. So rather through pottery, human facilitate interaction with the surrounding natural and cultural environment, right? So depending on what you'll eat, you'll make a certain type of pottery. If you have storage requirement, you'll make certain type of pottery. If you have trade, you'll make certain type of pottery. Depending on the clay of that region, you'll make certain type of pottery. Depending on the pigments that you find in this region, you'll make certain colors of the pottery. So that's a product that is produced when human is constantly interacting with the environment through their culture. Okay. Now, say for example, if your environment can support something, but you don't have the technological knowledge of that thing, you'll never produce it. Right. So based on the cultural understanding or the technological, political, social understanding of that particular community, individual interacting with that knowledge as well as its natural environment would produce this particular pottery. So that's why we'll see same people in the same region over the time period will make different types of pottery, right? It would be also wrong to believe that, when you have pottery that, earlier communities were making poor pottery, and as we, grow up in time and the newer people were making better pottery. That's also not true, because you also have to understand what is the use of the pottery. Are we using it as a premium object? Are we using it as very day-to-day object? So depending on that, we'll also see, some people were making too much effort in making pottery, like nicely painted, very well fired, nicely sleeved. And then at the same time, we are also seeing, sometimes potteries are making very crudely. Even like a few years back, I think even today you'll see the tea that we have in most of the places in Bengal, they use this bhar, right? And when you see those kind of pots, you'll see they were made in like fast-paced environment, like there was no quality control, like some were straight, some are bended, some are overfired, some are ill-fired. So you'll clearly see that, it's a very distinctive nature of making pottery. And then at the same time, you'll see some of the Harappan pottery, like nicely, beautifully painted, like this pot that you see at the back, like there's a bull image, and all this design nicely sleeved and everything. And you can see like how much time and effort has gone into making this pot. Right. So now when we shift the idea of a pot is just a product into an object that human have created in their mind and had played a role within the society beyond just storing food, we can kind of come up with the idea that pottery is not an object but a medium. A container of information, a medium through which we can understand all these different sorts of interaction. Okay, and then we also have to realize that pottery were not designed, produced, used, and transformed in a vacuum, right? So it is not that A potter would wake up without thinking, without any influence from the society and environment, would just make a pottery so that things can be served. No, there was enough thought, enough design, enough ideas, enough ideologies gone into producing this pot. So when we think of that, potters are produced in a regional sociopolitics, and the perception of regional environment determined and defined the role of a pot, the materialistic, symbolic, as well as utilitarian context, right? So how the pot would be used, how the pot would be designed, what material we would use for certain type of pot, everything that entire natural and cultural environment defines. And this is a complete paradigm shift of using pottery as a tool, that, okay, this pottery means Harappan, this pottery Neolithic, this pottery medieval, this pottery historic, to understanding that why that particular individual made that pot and why certain people have used that pot, what those pots were used for, right? Do they have any certain particular function, like particular design have any particular function? Because they cannot be random, right? Like this much of design, this much of effort cannot be random. Like there has to be a reason. So then when we are trying to go into those reasons, we are moving into just giving you objects into telling stories. Now, another thing that I would very briefly touch, and then just to give you a background. Now, this is a cattle tooth, right? So now in archaeology, what would happen is that we'll go excavate a site, we'll find a lot of animal remains, and then we identify that, okay, this is a cattle tooth, and fine. But within those tooth, there is also valuable information, like the pot we have discussed, then there is this animal remains also. So there is a very common saying is that we are what we eat. Okay, so that's true biologically, that's also true culturally. Okay, so now biologically, the composition of this particular tooth is based on what that particular animal has eaten. And there is a way that we would be able to understand what the animal has eaten, both food and water, and what climate that animal was, or where the animal was, and if the animals were moving and all sorts of things, we would be able to learn by looking into this tooth. So these groups are the places where I have taken samples to analyze, and then this is a diagram of an oxygen isotope. So this actually tells that that this part of the tooth was grown when there was winter or summer, and this part of the tooth was grown when there was monsoon. So if there is any dietary change between winter and dietary change in the summer, because nowadays when we have refrigerator and when we have storage, this is not going to change. Right, because throughout the year we are eating rice, throughout the year we are eating fish or whatever. But for these animals, when there were like lack of storage, this would vary, right? Because every season, like rice will not grow in every season, right? Some grasses will not grow in every season. So then seasonal variation would be evident. Now, depending on, what season it is, we can look into if the animal were consuming C4 type grasses and C3 type of grasses. So I'll just give you a very basic understanding of what is a C4 type grass and what is a C3 type grass. So majority of the grasses that we see around us are generally C4. So when we are talking about cultivated grasses, so that would be millets. So all different kinds of millets that we have are C4 type grasses. At the same time, there are maize, which is C4 type grasses. Sugarcane is a C4 type grass. So majority of the grasses are generally C4 type grasses. And then we also have C3 type of grasses, so which would be wheat, barley, rice. These are C3 type of grasses. But majority of all the plants, all the trees and shrubs, they are C3. Okay, and there is also something in between called CAM, which falls between C3 and C4. Pineapple is an example of that. Now, what is C3 and C4? There are two different types of plants based on how they photosynthesize the sunlight. And based on that, so, we know basic idea of photosynthesis is that a plant takes carbon dioxide and then make food out of it and release oxygen. And so then we consume that plant. So that carbon dioxide that they are taking and the separation of carbon and the storage of carbon would vary whether that's a C4 type plant or a C3 type plant. So some people would have different carbon isotopes and some plants would have C3 plants would have slightly different carbon isotope. So by looking into those carbon isotope, we would know whether it's a C4 type plant or a C3 type plant. Now, why is this important? Because using this we can talk about whether they are consuming wild grasses, whether they are consuming cultivated grasses. Okay, because we know most of the cultivated plants are C3, wheat, barley, rice. Some cultivated plants are C4. So using those sort of data, this sort of information, we can acquire. Okay, so these are some of the things like, in monsoon there will be more leaves, in dry climate there will be more grasses, and depending on if they were eating more grains, winter and summer, depending on the cultivation time period, because millets will be generally cultivated into monsoon, so they will be mostly available in the winter. But then wheat and barley, depending on where they are, like if you are going into northwestern India, then they are generally grown into the winter, and then they are getting available into the summer and monsoon. So depending on the season, you will have availability of different grains and different grasses. That would tell us what that animal was eating. So this is the general basic idea. Okay. Any question of this?
Sir, we are, as we we are in live in YouTube, so can we take some questions, because there are 78 person is watching, so there are
Yes,
some
go
questions
ahead,
we
go ahead.
have. Okay, sir. The first question is from Rakhi Mondol. She asked a question: ki, how reliable is the typological classification of prehistoric pottery in India, considering the regional variations and the limited number of stratified archaeological sites?
Okay, so that's a very good question, Raki. So the answer is both yes and no. Okay, so there are potteries that did not continue into a different cultural period. So we can definitely do broader classification of culture, but the problem is not using the pottery to classify a culture, but the idea is that cultures are segmented is a problem. Culture change is a continuous process. Okay, so it's not always that different. So it is true that some types of pot are not there anymore, but you can think of this as, okay, so have you seen those bell curve kind of a thing? So those bell curves are kind of a thing that sometimes some things become popular, and then you see a lot of them, and then it kind of tails down and the tail continues. So depending on the type of pot that you're selecting, based on that, you will be able to tell that, yeah, culture changed. Yeah, and this is an Iron Age pottery. This is a historic pottery. This is a Harappan pottery. Absolutely fine. But within a region, there is also pottery that continues. Okay, so then if you only have those pottery that are continuous, so one of the good example of pottery that continues are the cooking pots. They generally have a continuous shape because there is literally no need of changing the shape. So then it is problematic. But in general, yes, and you can do broader classification. But the idea that we're talking about, or I'm talking about, is that is not a good idea of segregating or punctuating culture change, right? Culture change is not punctuated. To give you an example, okay, I always give this example to my students. So bell-bottom pants. So you have all seen that Amitabh Bachchan wearing bell-bottom pants. So there was a time period when we see, a large number of bell-bottom pants, and everybody is wearing bell-bottom pants. And nowadays it is not common. And then again, you will see today it's kind of coming out. And there would be boys and girls who would be wearing bell-bottom pants. It's more common among girls nowadays than boys. But if you're talking about pants, so then there was a period when it was like too many, a huge curve, and then there were periods when it is not so much, and then it's coming back. So it's always like this. And that's the thing. But again, if you're not talking about bell-bottom pants, you're talking about another type of jeans or something, then you don't see so much of change. Like there's literally little change. So this sort of, but can we, just by looking into those pants, can we say that this is 80s and 90s India versus it is 21st century India? Yes, we can, right? So yes, the answer is yes. We're using pottery, you can classify things, but then are we completely two different culture? No, because it's not punctuated. It's not that 90s ended and 21st century started. No, it didn't happen that way. It's a smooth transition from one cultural identity into another cultural identity, from one practice to another practice. So that sort of, gliding movement is how we should imagine culture change, rather than thinking, okay, Neolithic ended, Chalcolithic started, Chalcolithic ended, Iron Age started, Iron Age ended, plastic age started. No, it doesn't happen that way. They transition from one to other. So it's not that one ends, another starts. So I don't know if I made it clear.
Okay,
Sorry.
thank you. And another question is from Arnav Rakshir, is also on the typology kind. Though I am not very much introduced in archaeology because I am in medieval, so I'm just reading out the question. Is the emphasis? The question is the emphasis on ceramic typology in Indian prehistoric archaeology an over reliance on material remains to construct cultural chronology, and does it obscure the possibility of non-material aspects of prehistoric life that are no longer accessible to archaeologists?
Okay. So I wouldn't call it over reliance, because that's all we have, material remains, right? We don't have any other remain. Like, we don't have ideological remain, we don't have symbolic remains. We can interpret something with that it is ideological, it is symbolic, but then it is also on a material remain, right? So a drawing, a painting on a pottery, you can identify that it has a symbolic meaning to it. Harappan seal, some of those so-called unicorns, they had a symbolic meaning to it. But then it is also on a material remains, which is a seal itself. So we cannot under rely on material culture, because that's all we have. Now the idea is, do we need to move from that material identity into an ideological or cultural interpretation of that object? Material interpretation into cultural interpretation, yes. That what should be the aim. Now there are different schools of archaeology with different thoughts. The post-procedural archaeology would have a different thought, the new archaeology would have a different thought. So there are different thoughts, but both are important. So sometimes we can definitely date an object, right? If we have radiocarbon, we can date. But the problem of radiocarbon dating is it can only date objects up to 55,000 years, maybe up to 60,000 years. So anything older than that, we cannot do radiocarbon dating. So then there are other ways of dating as something. But then again, when we are not able to date a culture, an object, or a time period, we have to rely on this stylistic dating, or relative dating that we call. So this is not a problem that we have to rely on relative dating. But then if we stop there, that, okay, this is Upper Paleolithic and these are the stone tools, that's all, then there's a problem. Then using those tools, using those information, their context, their composition, their style, the technology that they used, everything combining, we have to tell the story. Okay, if we are not telling the story and if we're just ending there, then that's incomplete.
Okay, sir. As for now, we have these two questions only, sir. We can proceed, sir. Thank you.
Okay, so now when we looked into the enamel isotope data, or the tooth isotope data from India in general, so this is some of the data that I have acquired over the years. So what we have, all the cattle buffalo, so we call them bovine, right? So cattle, buffalo, cows and buffaloes, from archaeological time period, from fossil time period, like prehistoric, Pleistocene, early Holocene, or pre-settlement era time period, and even in the historic time period, we see that these bovines have purely consumed mostly seafood type grasses. Okay, throughout the time period. Now it changed with the modern time period, because now modern we are producing fodder for animals, so then it changed. But otherwise, during the historic and prehistoric time period, it was mostly seafood. So all the cattle buffalo have consumed seafood. Now, if we see the caprine, so that would be sheep and goat, you see they consumed generally a mixed diet, ranging from so then this is C3, and anything between falls about mixed. So more majority of the cattle, they consumed seafood diet. Majority of the caprine, they consumed mixed diet with a lot of C3 diet as well, but not so much C4 diet. Why? Because cow, buffalo, they were grazers, so they eat grass. If you have seen a goat, they generally eat leaves. That's why they call browsers. So because, as I said, like because most of the leaf, like all of the leaves are C3, so that's why they have such a strong C3 signature. But they can sometimes, in Bengali, there is a phrase like that, goats eat everything. That's true. Because even though they are browsers, they also eat grasses when they are nice, green and tender. So when they were eating those grasses, that's why they also have a little bit of C4 signature. But they generally consume mix. Like when there are leaves, there are leaves. When there are grasses, there are grasses. And things like that. But it also like, if you have animals in your house, you have cows and you have goats, and you have got some grasses for the cows, the goats will also chew on those. Now, then there is pigs. And we know pigs are like human, they eat everything, but then they don't go and eat grasses. Like they're omnivorous, but they don't eat grasses. So they mostly eat other types of plants like grains and leaves, also not so much of leaves, but meat and stuff like that. So that's why we have pigs that clearly falls into the C3 range. Okay, so we'll remember this because I'll come back to this when we interpret some of the things. So cows and buffaloes, archaeological time period and pre-archaeological time period, they mostly had a lot of C3 type, C4 type grasses. Okay, goats, they had a mixed diet, and pigs, they had a C3, very strong C3 diet. Just will remember this. Okay. Now, when we talk about ceramic, there are like when we can definitely do, as I answered the two questions, that we can definitely use ceramic as a tool for punctuated chronology, right? We can just look into the ceramic and say, okay, this is that. And that is called the stylistic analysis of the ceramic. So that would be the shape of the ceramic, the design of the ceramic, sometimes the firing of the ceramic, how thick it is, what kind of clay they used, if they used a lot of mica versus if they used a lot of shell versus if they used a lot of sand. So all these things we can look into and tell what kind of pot it is. But then a pot is not just an object, but it had an use, right? So you have to imagine that, it's not that some people just produce is like a symbolic thing and they never used it. Maybe some pots were produced like that, but the majority of the pot had an use. Now, when we're talking about use, we are talking about two kinds of use. One is intended use and one is actual use. Okay, now, what is intended use? Intended use is like when the potter was making that pot, he had something in his mind that this pot would be used for this particular function. Okay, so say for example, if he's making a cooking pot, he would make it porous. He would add a lot of sand or a lot of grog or a lot of other things so that the pottery can expand and it will be crudely made and things like that so that it can withstand the heat. Versus if he's making a tableware or a nice looking pot, then they would know that this pot would be in somebody's house and it will only come out when some guests are there to serve them. So then they have a very nice way of making those pots. So then by looking into the technological choices and stylistic choices, we would know that what was the intended function of the pot, right? So say for example, a cooking pot would never have like huge, nicely detailed decoration. There's no point because it will be covered by soot. So nobody will be able to see it. So definitely that they would not do. Similarly, a tableware, like a nice plate, a nice dish, or nice storage jar, they would make it like highly decorated because a life of a storage jar is like 60 years, 70 years, sometimes 100 years or more. So then if it nicely designed, it will be there for a very long time. So people would be able to, see that particular artistic skill of that particular potter, right? So then there is point of making it stylistically very pleasing. Otherwise, there's none. Similarly, a tableware would be made thin and fine, very nicely smooth and everything, versus a cooking pot will be crudely made because there's no point of making it thin because if you make it too thin, it will break and things like that. So that will give me the intended use. Now, intended use is not always the actual use. Okay, then we also have to see the actual use. So say, for example, a lot of you have a pencil. So the intended use is to write, but then you use it to sketch your back. Some girls use it to tie their head, tie their hair. Some would use it to punish their students, to put them in between your fingers and press it. So there will be hundreds of use. So that's the actual use of an object, although its intended use is to write. How do you know actual use of a pottery? By looking to use alteration. So when you use something, it changes. Okay, one of the great example of use alteration that you clearly see is your chappal. When you look into your sandals, you'll see that there's a clear mark of your feet on your sandal, right? Because that's the mark of the use. Now, if somebody has no idea of what chappal is, and you give it to him and ask him like what it is, one thing that he can look, oh, okay, it has a flat surface, it has two straps, so you can put your finger. So then it is probably used as a chappal, like it is something to wear on the foot. And some people, when you have a clear mark of foot on that particular thing and you give it to somebody, they don't have to look into that technological choices. They can clearly see the use alteration of the foot mark and say, okay, this is something that you have wore on your feet, right? So that's called use alteration. So there are two types of alteration when we are talking about pottery, but in most of the things, there's chemical alteration and there's physical alteration. So the chappal example was a physical alteration. So even in pottery, there would be physical alteration, right? So you would be firing the pottery, so there will be soot mark. You'll be using spoons within the pottery, so there will be scratches. You'll be cleaning the pottery, there will be scratches. You put the pottery always on one surface, there will be chips and scratches at the bottom. So those are physical alteration. And then there are chemical alterations. So when you are cooking into a pot, because the pots are porous in nature, there will be things that will go out of the pot during use. So a lot of volatiles will leave the pot, but also, so that's called dissolution. And then there is also incorporation. There will be things that will be incorporated into the pot from the food, like lipids, proteins, starch, and phytoliths, right? So now by looking into these things, by studying the dissolution and by incorporation, we would know what this pottery was used for, okay? And then we'll be able to tell the story of the people, okay? So that's me. During my master's, we were cooking, we were doing some, it's not experimental, it is just that we are making chicken in a pot that was meant to use to contain water. So this is a water pot. And then we have changed it. So we have broke the top part of it so that we can use it to cook chicken because we need a bigger mouth. So now you can see the intended use, this pot contain water, but the actual use converted into a cooking pot. Okay. Now, why this become a good cooking pot? Just because all the water jars are porous in nature, so then they have space to expand. So then the pot wouldn't break. So this clearly you can see the intended versus actual use of a pot. Okay. Now what happens? So they make a pot. Okay. And then clear nicely a very nice pot, and then you start using it. Okay. So during the making of the pot, then they make painting on the pot, so then you add things. Sometimes you also use sealant inside the pot, then you add things. Then you start cooking those things, so then the sealant would go out of the pot if you use it for cooking, because high heat, the volatiles will go out. And then things that are already there in the pot would get incorporated, get into the matrix of the pot, and it will stay there. Then the pot breaks. When the pot breaks, you can throw it if you're rich. If you're not so rich, and Indians are famous for recycling their things, they'll recycle it. So then this pot becomes a pot to feed your animals. And we have all seen in our houses that, an old pot or an old steel pan would end up being the plate for our dogs or cats that we have in our house. So that is also true throughout the world, right? So then you do it for secondary uses. Sometimes if the pot is broken, then you will use it like a water container. You can use it to make chicken that we were doing, or they can be used to, contain some water, or they can be used to, I don't know, a number of things you can use other than what it was meant to be, right? Then it's a completely intended use. Now this pot is not good for the intended use. Now it has a different use. Then it breaks, you bury the pot, or sometimes you break the pot and then you also mix it with other clay to make another pot. But at the same time, sometimes this pot, these fragments, you can use to make something completely different, right? So sometimes you can use this to make tiles. Sometimes, hopscotch, if you have played in your childhood, hopscotch, they are also use the pot to make hopscotch, spindle holes, and a lot of things that you can make out of those pots, right? And then finally, at one point when nothing can be done, you will discard the pot. So during this use, there will be things that will be incorporated from the actual use. Then when it is buried, there will be soil microorganism that will come into. There will be things in the pot that will leach out over time with the action of water and acidic nature of the soil, sometimes alkaline nature of the soil. Then when as archaeologists, we excavate things, we also contaminate things, right? So we have to be very careful when we're excavating things, and that's a completely different discussion. We can have it later. But we do a lot of destruction. So we clean the pots. You remember, I don't know how many of you have been to an excavation. When they find pot, goes into a pottery yard, and then some lady will go take hundreds of potsherds, put into a gamla and clean it. So then with the water, you are contaminating all the pots, things from one pot going into the other pot and vice versa. So we contaminate things. But then also when we excavate, we write on pottery, contaminate it. We handle the pottery, contaminate it. We store it in a storage, we contaminate it. So there are hundreds of ways we contaminate it. So this is the entire life cycle of a pot. And then as archaeologists like me, I have to go through this entire session, understand which were incorporated at what stage, and then removing all these post-depositional contamination and figure out what was the actual content of the pot. Okay, so now once we analyze the pot, so I mostly work with lipids, so then we can find out some lipids. So these peaks that you see, those are lipids that I have extracted from pots from, I don't think these are from one particular site, I think they're from different sites. I think this aquatic fat is from Southern Ontario, Canada. This plant, I think this is Harappan. I think this animal and plant, they are Harappan, but I'm not very sure at this stage anymore. But yeah, so this is how the distribution of different fatty acid would look like. And then by just looking at the distribution, we would know whether they were animal fats, plant oil, aquatic fat. This is the vessel portion and the content of lipid. This is also a Southern Ontario Canadian pot. But you can see, like, base would have base and shoulder and neck. Base would have the high concentration of lipid. Body would have the lowest concentration of lipid, and shoulder and neck, they're like equally distributed. Like it can have good content or it can also have bad content depending on what you have in it. But so the base and the neck portion is the two best shards that we can use to analyze the pottery for their content. Okay, but there are n number of analysis we can do on pottery, and we can talk about that, but not important now. Okay, so this is the site that we'll be talking about. I don't know what time. Okay, so we're reaching about 1 hour, right? So this is the site of Kotarabadli. This is located in the middle of two rivers. This is the excavated, foundation of houses. There is this settlement wall. These are the shards that we have analyzed from Kotarabadli. And what we have found is that there is meat, and then there is dairy. Okay, and we'll come to that. And then there are different types of pottery. So cooking vessel, we have meat in cooking vessel. We also have meat in, we have dairy in cooking vessels. We have bowls, so we have meat in bowls. We also have dairy in bowls, and all sorts of things. So now let's look at these two things. So there is one. So these meats are coming from animals that consumed mostly C3 type of diet. And these are the animals, these are the meat and dairy that's coming. They have consumed mostly C4 type of diet. So if you remember the first slide that we talked about, so the cattle and buffalo, they are mostly consumed strongly C4 type diet. So all the dairy at this site, Kotarabadli, are coming from cattle and buffalo. There is no dairy from C3 type animals. So sheep goat, there is no dairy. These are the pigs or the monogastric animals, and as we have talked, they are also mostly C3. But these are generally the goat meats. So all this from here to here, they're sheep goat meat. So sheep goat meat were the primary meat. They were also consuming cattle buffalo meat, and then the most of the dairy was coming from cows or buffaloes at this stage. Now these are some of the bowls which contained meat. You can guess the shape, I guess. These are some of the bowls, and these are the cooking pots that were used to process dairy. Okay, this is one pot that were used to process dairy. Now I don't know, it's difficult to say whether they were only milk or they were something made out of, they made something out of milk. We don't know that, so we call it dairy, so milk product pretty much. These are ladles. So that they look like the ladles that we generally use today for oil and things like that. Do I have a better picture of it? No. But they are ladles, so they are used to serve meat, most likely serving ladles. Then we also have one perforated vessel. It could be dairy, but then it falls in the middle, so it could be dairy versus it could be oil and things like that. But there is only two of it, so we don't know. It's hard to say this stage. Okay, so one more thing. So we know that, just going back here a little bit, so we know they consumed dairy from cattle. It's right in Gujarat, and meat from sheep goat. Okay, so we come back to this again. Now, when we look into the distribution of animals in Gujarat during the Harappan time, now this paper is also published. One of my undergraduate student worked on this. So what we see in Gujarat, there are more animals. So all the way up to here, the gray border, these are cattle and buffalo. So you can see the number of cattle and buffalo versus number of sheep and goat. So we can clearly see there are more cattle and buffalo at this site or at sites in Gujarat than there are more sheep and goat. Okay, and then when we see here, so this green line is Gujarat. Okay, so focus on this. So we have about early and mature phase. We have about 3 cattle per 1 sheep goat. Okay, and this also looks like 1:3 ratio, right? And then early phase to mature phase was same, but then in the late phase we can see there are about 6 cattle per 1 sheep goat. So we can clearly see that the importance of cattle grown into Gujarat. Now that could be partly because they were consuming a lot of dairy, also the climate and environment itself. Now look at Haryana. So at one point there were like 10 cattle per sheep goat, right? So there was clearly a cattle dominated region. Now why? Because there are cultivation, they were primarily plowing animals, but also there's a lot of importance of dairy. But then slowly, we can see an increase of sheep and goat or a decrease of cattle. Now this could mean a lot of things. This could be just, intrasite variation, but this could also indicate that slowly, maybe the consumption of meat increased, or it was difficult to maybe maintain large number of cattle. So the number of sheep goat didn't increase, but the number of cattle kind of reduced. And the larger economy, like household maintaining many number of cattle, had to chip it down to maintain like few cattle, like 3, 4, 5, 6 cattle. But in Gujarat, we can clearly see that cattle are getting dominated, or there are a lot of cattle. Now see, this is the site again. As you can see, there is a lot of ash at this site. Okay, so this is the settlement wall, and there is a lot of ash, and this is a residential area. There is no ash. So now the question is where this ash is coming from. What is the source of this ash? So when I looked into the composition of the ash, what I found is like there is a lot of phytoliths. Now these phytoliths are grass phytoliths, so they are coming from the grass. So now the question is, why are there so much grass phytoliths? Like why were they burning so much grass at this site, like everywhere? But then there's another interesting thing. So I don't know how visible it is. So these arrows that you can see, they are called spherulites. They are silica crystals that get produced in the stomach of the herbivorous animals. Okay, so cattle, buffalo, sheep, goat, horse, camel, they all produce this kind of spherulites. And they come out with the dung. So in a region, if there is a lot of dung, you'll see a lot of spherulite. So in that, we also see a lot of spherulite. So then it is not the grass, it is the dung. And you can also see like some of these spherulites are burnt. So you can see that it turned black because then it is burnt. And why it turned black? Because then they were burning dung, right? So then they have phytoliths that's coming from the grass, and they have spherulites, there's dung. So that means a lot of this ash are actually dung. Now this makes sense, because why would otherwise they burn grass? But we know that they were consuming a lot of animals. We know they were mostly agropastoral settlement, and we know that if you have a lot of animal, they will produce a lot of dung. And then seeing the dung example, we now know that they were also burning this dung either as fuel or to keep the city clean. We have also looked into the sediment data and see that in the general environment of this area, and even the ash itself was high in C4. So that again suggests that a lot of this dung were actually coming from animals that consume C4. And we know who those animals were, cattle and buffalo, right? But we are also looking to this ash data and the settlement data. We see more nitrogen value. So this nitrogen value could indicate that they were dung, fresh dung, but it also could be that they were burning vegetation and that increased the nitrogen value. And then we can also see the carbon and nitrogen value. We don't have to go into this, but we'll mostly focus on this too. So we know that a lot of these ash were actually coming from dung, but also a lot of burning activities that were happening at the settlement to keep the settlement clean was actually incorporating because of this carbon and nitrogen isotope value changed. Now let's see what was the general environment of Kutch during that time. So we can see this is Kotada Badli, and all these sites are from Kutch. So this is Run of Kutch today. This is Oriotimbo, Babarkot, Kotada Badli from a similar region. And we can clearly see that they are predominantly a C4 type environment rather than a C3 type environment. Now, why is this? Because there were a lot of grass. So if there are a lot of grass, it's easy to maintain animals. And it was not a C3 environment. So that means it was not a foresty environment. There was a lot of grass. If it was a foresty environment, we'll see a lot of C3 types. So these figures will shift here, which it not. But there is also not like pure C4. It is not here. So then they had a mixed environment where there were leaves, but at the same time, there are also a lot of grasses. So this is the site that looks today. And you can clearly see that, this is the landscape. So you have bushes, a lot of bushes, and then there are a lot of grasses, but you don't see forest, and you can see that expands. So this is a river bed, and you don't see a lot of forest. So you can clearly see this is probably similar to what Gujarat would have looked like 4,500 years ago, where there will be grasses and some bushes, but there's no forest. So then we know in this sort of environment, animal herding, particularly cattle who consume a lot of grass, would have been easier. But at the same time, this is not a very giving environment because it was very dry. So unlike Haryana, where there were like a lot of water and things like that, this is something problematic. So these people, even though cattle herding was possible, then it was not the best option. So they had some cattle, they predominantly had more cattle, but then it was not that they had a lot of cattle or a lot of animals. So, but animal herding would have been a very viable food procurement process in here rather than agriculture, because you can see the landscape is not ideal for agriculture. Anyway, so this is the general way that we can look into the food, the procurement of the food and different types of food, and we can talk about how the landscape was. Okay, so this is my presentation in general. I rushed through a bit, but then if you have any question, I'll be happy to answer them.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir, for this astonishing lecture. We can take the questions from, as usual, from the YouTube. There are, I think, 5 questions. The first one is asked by Shantan Sarkar. He's asking that can next generation technologies such as ancient DNA, in bracket aDNA, and proteomics, the study of proteins, provide clearer insights into the domestication and consumption of C3 and C4 plants in prehistoric India? How do these methods compare to traditional isotopic or pytholic analysis in resolving dietary patterns?
Okay, so yes, ancient DNA. So we can actually extract ancient DNA from a lot of different things. So we can obviously extract ancient DNA from animal remains and plant remains. Also extract from sediments. We can also extract ancient DNA from other cultural objects like pottery and stuff like that. We can also extract proteins from pottery. We can extract proteins not so much from sediments, but also from other animal remains. Yes, it can give us a better picture. Only problem is when they are preserved. Now, lipids and stable isotope, they are very robust methods. So that's why they are so much used globally, because of the robustness of this method and the preservation of this of the material. Now, I have tried to extract protein from pottery. I'm currently trying to extract protein from animal remains. The preservation is very bad. So we didn't find any protein from, we found some protein from pottery, but heavily contaminated. But we tried to extract collagen from animal remains from Harappan time. We haven't had good luck yet extracting proteins, but if we can extract protein, then yes, it can definitely give you a better picture. Not always though, because certain things are better with isotopes, certain things are better with lipids. But again, if you do protein, you can do isotopes on protein. Okay, so you can do isotopes on elements, and protein is a compound, right? So, yes, we can do better only if preserved. Archaeological material from India is not so well preserved, so we haven't had good luck. There are human DNA that people have tried a lot from India. I think so far there were only one human remain from Harappan site where they were able to extract DNA. But also the other thing is the cost input. So sometimes doing ancient DNA is so costly that, and the information that we would get from ancient DNA, we can easily get using much cheaper techniques like lipids and stable isotopes. So we don't necessarily have to do DNA. But if you want to do DNA from sediments, particularly, like we can do DNA from sediments, it's very costly, right? Because you'll have GBs of DNA data, and then you have to sit down and synthesize that data. You have to sort that data, which is actually ancient DNA, which is modern DNA, because it is not a closed environment where you'll only have ancient DNA, right? You'll also have a lot of modern DNA. What do you do with those modern DNA? So you have to separate them. So it's very time consuming, very costly. So not a very ideal way of doing it, but then we haven't had good luck so far. So can you imagine, like, you have sitting down with billions of DNA pairs, sorting them through, and then figuring out there is no ancient DNA, and then your entire thing is gone. So yes and no. If you have good preservation, then yes, definitely it's worth trying. But if you don't, then bad luck.
Thank you, sir. We have another question from Shubhadeep Ghosh. He is asking that how do archaeologists differentiate between food preparation, consumption, and ritual offering in prehistoric context? Could some of the evidence interpreted as dietary remains actually reflect ritualistic or symbolic practices rather than actual food consumption?
Okay. So you can do it based on the context. So one thing we have in archaeology that we rely a lot on is context, association, and the location of something. Now, if we have a ritualistic context where that we can interpret the context to be ritualistic context, and then we find food remains in there, then we know that those food remains were used in this ritualistic context. But if we don't have a clear idea of a context to be a ritualistic context and not a general domestic context, then it becomes difficult. Like in India, it is slightly problematic. It would probably be less problematic if we go into historic time period. But like Harappan time period, we don't necessarily have context where we can clearly identify that this is a ritualistic context. Okay, there are people who have argued for ritualistic existence of ritualistic context. So if I explain ritualistic context a bit, so you excavate a place where you find a fireplace, let's say, in a very unique location that is not domestic or not feasting, and then you find very unique things in there, and then you can identify that's a ritualistic context. Now, a ritual it would be difficult to separate between ritualistic and ceremonial context, and when we have ceremonial context, it would be difficult to separate whether it's a religious ceremony or a non-religious ceremony. So all these things becomes a bit complicated, especially when we don't have very nice contextual data or written evidences. But in other parts of the world, we know that there are ritualistic. Okay, a great example of ritualistic context would be burial pots, right? So those are those that is not a domestic context, that a ritualistic context. So then, if we find some food items from there, then we know that these food have a ritualistic significance. Now, whether are we expecting a completely different type of food? Probably not. It was probably the similar type of food, but then that's a ritualistic context. An example. In other parts of the world, we have certain pots that those were made specifically, like heavily decorated, made specifically for, like if you look into Inca and Maya civilization, you will see there are corn pots. The pots look like corn deity, and then there were beverages in those pots. Then we know those are ritualistic pots. So yeah, finding religious ritualistic context is a bit difficult, but then we can definitely find ritualistic context, and then things that are in that context will be able to tell that's a ritualistic food, right? Example would be burial.
Thank you, sir. Another question is from Odisha. She is asking that can we trust the assumption that shifts from hunting gathering to agricultural practices, that is, the introduction of rice or millet, indicate a linear progression towards civilization in quote in prehistoric India? Could such transition represent responses to environmental pressures rather than cultural advancements?
Okay. Okay. First is like it's so a lot of our interpretations are not based on assumptions. So we don't assume. We give probabilities. Now, why we give probabilities? Because there are things that can be interpreted differently. So we can talk about like there is a probability of this versus probability of that. But in science, we cannot just assume without any evidence, right? So we provide evidence, and based on the evidence, then we make an argument, right? So we get probability or we make an argument. We don't necessarily assume, so that's not the right word. First, the second thing is that was it a linear progression? Yes, definitely it was a linear progression, and it was not a segregated or punctuated progression. It was not that one day all the hunter-gatherers died and then suddenly a group of agriculturists came and then they started agriculture. That's not true. But it is also not true that all the hunter-gatherers one day decided that we'll do agriculture and then they started agriculture. Or it is also not true that some of the agricultures, like all the hunter-gatherers moved into agriculture. No. So there were some hunter-gatherers who moved into agriculture. Some part of the diet was agriculture based, some part of the diet was still hunting gathering. Even until historic period, we'll see people like we have seen kings are going for hunting. Why are they going for hunting? So hunting was still a prized profession. There were hunters, there were gathering, and there were agriculture. So then at one point there were more of those. So there was some part of your diet is based on agriculture, some part is hunting, some part is gathering. Then it goes into a phase where when there is a lot is based on agriculture and a little bit of hunting and gathering. Nowadays it's mostly agriculture and very little hunting and gathering. We don't do it anymore. But we're talking about very recent past. But in the past there were combination of all sorts of things. Now, whether it's a cultural advancement or whether it's a climatic reaction or reaction to a climate change, it could be both. Okay. Now, it is not necessarily a reaction that climate changed and nowadays cultivation is the only option and you cannot do hunting and gathering, or reaction to culture. So it could be a combination of many things, right? In certain places, they slowly. Also, one thing you have to remember when we are talking about this sort of interaction. Humans have been interacting with all these plants and animals. So it's not that one day they deciphered that, oh, there is this animal called cow, we can domesticate it. Or, oh, wow, there is this animal, this plant called millet, we can domesticate it. No. These grasses and these plants animals existed for a very long time period. Humans have been interacting with, and then slowly, they were getting in connection with each other. Okay, they are in contact with each other, and from a wild variety into a domestic variety, there is a long gap. Okay, think of a buffalo, a bull, and you have to domesticate it. So first you have to be friend with the bull, then you have to tame the bull, then you have to genetically modify the bull, then selectively breed the bull to come into a stage when there is a domesticated bull. Okay, so now this entire period of this shift takes thousands of years. Okay, so first they may have started with few animals, and it was maybe not a deliberate choice. They figured out that bulls and cows are more friendly to humans, so then they started domesticating them. Why didn't they domesticate lion or tiger, right? Because they were not friendly to human. Like, it's 99% of the chance if you go try to tame a lion, you'll die, right? But that was probably not the case for sheep, goat, cattle, or deer to a certain extent. Sometimes deer are also a little problematic, but sheep, goat, and cattle and buffalo, they were not a lot of problem. They were friendly to human. So then humans started interacting with them. So then you have to understand it's a very slow and long process. So the way history is taught that we had hunting, gathering, and then suddenly we have domestication, agriculture. That's absolutely false. We had hunting, gathering, and then for a very long period of time we had gardening, small cultivation. You get a bunch of grains that you find they are tasty. You started putting them next to where you live, and then you got some grains. Then you consume those grains, but then you also do hunting and gathering. But because they are so little and so few, they are preserved in archaeological record. Also, they are not so much morphologically modified or genetically modified that we would not know if they were kind of managing those plants and those animals for a very long period of time. So yes, people have been managing them for a very long period of time, and it took a very long period of time for an animal or plant to get domesticated. Okay, so yes, it is a very linear, very lengthy process, and it is also not, it did not happen in isolation. There were people moving around, there were new ideas coming in. So some places it could take like thousands of years, some places it could just be an immediate interaction and then an adoption to domestication. A great example of that would be North America, right? So North America, they were hunting, and then suddenly Europeans came, or like pre-European, some domesticated things came, and then they suddenly started domesticating. Okay, but it was not a slow, steady domestication of a lot of things. Even for India also, if you think, something we indigenously domesticated and something we adopted as domesticated products, right? So say, for example, we still don't know if we have domesticated cattle and buffalo. Some people would argue, yes, we did. Some people would argue, yes, no, we did not. So we adopted domesticated variety. So in that case, we did not indigenously domesticated things, right? We adopted domesticated horse. We didn't indigenously domesticate horse, right? We adopted domesticated wheat and barley. We did not indigenously domesticated wheat and barley, but we did indigenously domesticated rice and millet. So then it's not like you have to see it from multiple dimensions. It's not one dimensional, one straight line of things. Okay. Like if you still have any question, you can ask me, and then it would be easy for me to interpret or explain. But I don't know if
we have only one question left, sir. It's asked by Mariam Begum. She's asking that in light of recent advance in lipid residue analysis, how do you refine our understanding of the use of C3 and C4 plants in prehistoric cooking and food storage? Could these techniques reveal the role of grasses in food processing technologies that are not easily visible through conventional archaeological method?
Okay, so a lot of the things is not visible through conventional archaeological methods. So conventional archaeological method would be looking into the macro remains of plants and animals. Now, macro remains, they don't generally preserve in archaeological context. Only in certain very unique condition they will preserve, otherwise they will not preserve. So say, for example, grains, when they are charred, would only preserve in archaeological context. If they are not charred, in certain extreme conditions, yes, they can preserve, but in majority of the context, they would not preserve. Okay, so it needs to have a very specific circumstances when it will be produced and then get preserved. So similarly, one thing that is very interesting. So I talked about dairy. Now, milk is something that will not preserve in archaeological record. right? Because it's a liquid. It will never preserve in archaeological record. So how do you know if these people have consumed milk? Okay, there's one way to know about possible milk consumption, because we don't have any physical evidence, is by looking into the death of the animals. So say, for example, if cow and buffalo, they lived till their adulthood when they will produce milk, or if they were killed when they were young, so before they can produce milk. So if you find a community where all the cows and buffaloes were killed when they were young and only a few were left alive, so that means they were not consuming milk. But at the same time, if you have a lot of old animals, and you know they are most likely consuming milk. But then also it is a bit problematic, because if you're using your animals for traction, like pulling cart, for plowing and things like that, then also you'll have a lot of old animals. So milk is something that lipid can identify, and or protein can identify, and the traditional methods cannot. Fish is something, because fish bones are very tiny and they're very soft, so they don't preserve in archaeological records. Sometimes they do, like big fishes, they can, like big vertebrates can preserve. So fish is something that lipid can do. Also, there are other things like vegetables. Okay, so you can only think of grains that would get charred and preserved, but vegetables, they don't preserve in archaeological record. Plant oil, they don't preserve in archaeological record. Right, so I don't think anybody has ever found a piece of cabbage or a piece of brinjal, eggplant, in archaeological record. So, so these are the things that you would not find in traditional method. For these, you have to look into either microscopic evidences like starch and phytoliths, or look into lipids and proteins. Then only you would know if they are there. Otherwise, it's absolutely not. Now, in terms of grasses, now because we predominantly consume grasses as human, because everything that we consume, rice, wheat, barley, millet, they're all grass, right? So grasses definitely played a major important role. Whether C3 or C4, it depends on some part of the world. I know it's nowadays is probably a very important aspect, because we need to know how much of our consumption was millet-based consumption, because we see the governments are kind of trying to push more of healthy millet-based diet and kind of go away from wheat, barley, rice-based diet. Now, as I said, in archaeological context, only in certain condition, wheat, barley, millets will be preserved when they are charred. Otherwise, they will not preserve. So let's say you are processing millets where there is no way of it getting charred. It will never preserve in archaeological record, right? So same with for wheat and same for rice. So if you're grinding wheat and never roasting wheat or not doing anything in front of the hearth, there's no way it will be preserved. Also, even though it is preserved, we don't know how much of it was actually consumed. And for that, we need to look into different things like starch and phytolates and lipids. Just to see, and then the general residue, just to see, whether what's the input from C3, what's the input from C4, to know how much of it was. Whether the diet, like today, our diet is predominantly starch-based diet, right? Because if you look at your plate, you'll see like 80% of it is rice or wheat or barley, and then only a little bit of other vegetables and protein. So whether was it a similar kind of diet, whether was it a a very different kind of diet where only where protein played a huge role and starch played a not so important role. For those, we need actually to look into those cooking pots, because we cannot just look into some starch grains and tell that, oh, they loved wheat. It's very difficult to say, yes, they consumed wheat, but we don't know how much of it is. Similarly, like we don't know how much of meat, we don't know how much of milk, we don't know how much of fish. All of this needs to be interpreted by looking into the pottery. Okay. We'll have a better interpretation if you go through the pottery.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for us joining today. It's an astonishing lecture, sir. And most welcome from our team, Voices from the Periphery. We wish you a better day and upcoming of these kinds of event. Thank you, sir, again for this astonishing lecture.
No problem. Thank you for the invitation, and I wish you all a very good luck.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Bye.